You couldn't eat it. Mike wasn't going to expend energy doing it.
You got it. But so before we get started, I highly recommend that you guys listen to the latest Sigma Nutrition podcast
With Israel?
with Israel. It is a classic Israel. The funny thing I laughed at the beginning was he starts with, just so you know, there's going to be some choice language in this podcast.
And then he immediately goes into his steroid use.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. He talks about his steroid use and his brain being mush because he's out all this gear. It's a good one. I didn't learn anything necessarily, but it was pretty comical.
Entertaining. What was the actual topic?
I don't know.
Comedy with Mike Israel.
I'm not
Mike Israel rant.
Mike Israel swearing, talking about his steroid use in his 22-week contest prep during COVID. Israel's a very intelligent guy, and I'm sure there's some good content in there, but I was just laughing the entire time. So it's worth the comedy.
His YouTube page, he's got like 15-minute education things that are actually really good and really, I mean, he condenses things. Israel's one of my favorite because he's so good at putting things in like digestible, easy to learn language in a very short period of time.
But he often has his shirt off in videos and swears.
Yes.
I haven't, I know who he is, but for whatever reason, I have not read or gotten into too much of his stuff, so I'll have to check it out. All right, with that said, though, we can jump into this article on core training for performance. They sort of, this takes obviously a little bit more of like a sport or, performance outlook on core training, but I thought it's a little bit old, and this is from like 8 years, 6, 7, 8 years ago or something like that, but still relevant. But let's jump right into it, I guess. I thought that to start it off, let's just define what the core is. And obviously there's not necessarily one standard definition of the core, and the article mentioned a bunch of definitions. So I'm curious, which of those maybe you guys gravitated to, or your preferred definition.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Okay. I had two of the definitions I liked most. The first one was from Richardson. It states that the core is a box with the abdominals in the front, the paraspinals and gluteals in the back, the diaphragm, the roof, the pelvic floor, and the hip grooves at the bottom. I like that one because it's just kind of easy to visualize. And then the other one I liked was the one that said that the core musculature includes muscles of the trunk and pelvis that are responsible for maintaining stability of the spine and pelvis, and are critical for the transfer of energy from larger torso to smaller extremities. I like that one because it was more functional. So the first one I could kind of visualize, and then the second one you can kind of more understand the function of the core. So those are my two favorite.
Yeah, for the same reason, I like the second one too. I also thought the one that I thought was interesting though was the one where he said, the axial skeleton and all of the soft tissue that has a proximal attachment to the axial skeleton. I thought was an interesting way of putting it, but the second one that Bailey said was the one that I gravitate towards wanting to use the most for myself.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say my two favorite were Fig and C. Fig's was the core is all of the anatomy between the sternum and the knees, where they focus on the abdominal region, low back, and hips. And then C was the second one that Bailey mentioned. It was a little bit more of a functional definition. The one I found the most interesting was BEMS. I thought it was lacking a little bit. Is the one about with the appendicular skeleton, or the axial skeleton versus appendicular skeleton. And if you take that definition, the glute medius wouldn't be a core muscle, which is fascinating because it's one of the most important for pelvic stability during dynamic movement. So I felt like that one was a little bit interesting. I don't really, it was just the definition of it. So I haven't read any of his other stuff, but I thought that was interesting that he would leave out a muscle such as the glute med in his definition.
Yeah, that is interesting. I hadn't even thought of that when I read it. Yeah. Mike, any thoughts that have not already been stated?
No, I think that the definition that Bailey mentioned, talking about the pelvic floor and the diaphragm, I think is important because we often don't think of those two structures as being involved in core stability, and they, along with the internal obliques and the transverse abdominis, probably play one of the more prominent roles in actual core stabilization. But I thought the other thing that was interesting is clearly, based upon all the different definitions structurally and functionally, it's pretty clear that this is why there's some confusion around the core, because it's very difficult to actually, at least functionally, define what the core is. Even among experts, it's a varied definition. And I think that probably underscores just the nature of some of the confusion that's occurred in this area of the body.
Yeah, definitely. I don't have a whole lot that hasn't already been stated. I did like the first definition because it's sort of like visually almost like the idea of like a front, back, bottom, and top, like a house almost, was kind of cool. And then the structural one as well, that, you know, talking about the function of it, providing stability for, you know, more distal limbs and stuff. That was interesting as well. But yeah, I mean, I guess with that definition stated there, you know, we basically, I mean, regardless of the definition, I think all of those sort of revolve around, you know, the muscles, central, a little more central in the hips, the spine, that provide stability during movement. So moving forward, the article mentioned a number of possible goals for core training. They talked about, obviously, you know, stability, strength, power, corrective exercise, that sort of thing. You know, we can train the core in a lot of different ways, with a number of different goals depending on how we do it. So I figured we could jump in there and talk a little bit about each of these.
One thing I want to go back to, and I was just thinking about it. Often in my definition of the core, I also talk in terms of shoulder girdle stability. And I realize that that's not a common element of the definition of core, but I think particularly for any dynamic upper body motion, the ability to stabilize the shoulder blade is critical to force production. And I think some of the definitions do allude to the fact that that musculature may be involved, but I think practically speaking, particularly for any kind of upper body force production, I do think it's important to ensure you have proper shoulder blade stability. And I've always found that interesting that that's not included in the traditional definitions of the core, but practically, I think it's relevant.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the same principles apply of, you know, you need that proximal stability in the shoulder girdle in order to, you know, properly, you know, for the more distal, you know, your arms to move properly, or whatever, your neck, that sort of thing. If you don't have stability, shoulder girdle, that's not going to work super well. And I imagine, I mean, I'm not an expert on this. It'd be really interesting if Dr. Tighe or someone was on here to talk a little bit about even how the core, you know, the more traditional core, you know, you're not looking at the shoulder girdle, probably influences what your shoulder girdle's doing as well, you know.
Sure, I've always looked at it like a house. It's like your pelvic girdle stabilization is what leads to spinal stabilization, is what leads to scapular stabilization. And if the structures that are inferior aren't stable, then you're not ever going to get the structures that are superior to be stable.
Yeah. Yeah, good point there though. All right, I mean, I guess talking about the first, the very first function or whatever goal of the core that they talk about is corrective exercise and prehab. They make a distinction a little bit between those two and talk a little bit about how you would program for those. What were your guys' main takeaways from the activation and corrective exercise prescriptive goal with core training?
These would be. Do you have any ideas?
Well, I think for first, I mean, I guess what was the distinction between corrective exercise and prehabs that they put out here? Does anyone remember that?
I remember reading it, but I don't.
Yeah, basically, I mean, essentially, corrective exercise is done with the intent to correct some dysfunction that is already existing, whereas prehab was a little more preventative, at least in the definition that that they mention here. I know in the context of what we do, sometimes we can use those sort of interchangeably, but prehab, something that you have somebody do to prevent dysfunction from even occurring, or maybe to address some like subclinical level of dysfunction that may exist that's not actually resulting in pain or noticeable movement dysfunction. Whereas a corrective exercise would be like you go to a chiropractor because you've got back pain already, and they give you exercises to fix that.
Well, obviously we do stuff like that in our strength class with all the people that are on those fitness programs. I would imagine we use it a lot for, like warming the person up, and kind of like getting their muscles ready for more intensive exercises that are coming up. And I know that's what or at least I viewed us using those in the strength room for, and kind of having people work through full range of motion stuff. And that seems to be pretty much what they wrote in the article too, of the importance of them. So I know we do that with our for sure with our fitness programs in the strength room.
Mhm.
Yep, they do
And
mention typically prehab corrective exercise is done as part of a dynamic warm up, or and that's sort of, that is sort of how we have it structured in a lot of our programs.
They can be used interchangeably.
Sorry, go ahead,
in a
Claire.
way.
What'd you
I
say?
said, well, they just confirming what you said, they can be used interchangeably, but inside the definition, they are just slightly different.
Yeah, if you want the way that they break it down, they do differentiate them a little bit. And I think, we tend to only prescribe prehabs when someone's already complaining of an issue, but I do think this is sort of, that they can, a good reason to have somebody on like those fitness routines as opposed to the hypertrophy routines that we have is just that more preventative nature of, having some of those in their routine regardless, or just adding it as part of something they do at home if they would be in hypertrophy. Sorry, Mike, you're gonna say something?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing that activation suggests is teaching the right sequence of muscle action to ensure that the exercise is being done correctly. We certainly know that you could look like you're doing an exercise correctly, but not be activating the proper musculature to do it. And I think that's very true of a lot of the core stabilization exercises. You can use a lot of your big, gross prime movers to stabilize body segments and not be activating your deeper intrinsic core muscles. Or you could actually take the time to learn how to activate those properly. And I think sometimes we visually watch the client perform the movement correctly, and we assume that they're activating musculature in the proper sequence, when in actuality, they're just activating the big movers that they normally would use to stabilize the body. And I think that's something we all could be a little more attuned to, is understanding what those little discrete and subtle changes are in someone's alignment or potentially their movement that might suggest they're using their global movers versus using some of the more intrinsic stabilizing muscles.
Yeah, it's one thing with the prehabs. I think it's a different way of, I think, what it's different. There's a different intent than what people are traditionally used to with exercising. Like you get a set of pelvic tilts or something, and you're like, oh, this is easy. I'm only doing 15 of these. Why am I, what's the intent here? Well, the intent is to make sure we're activating, the right muscles as opposed to just producing the movement. It's more about, making sure you're firing muscles in the correct order, that sort of thing, which is, I think, a little bit, it requires a lot of concentration, which something I think we could definitely coach our clients on when they're doing those types of exercises in the workout room with us.
I'm curious, for those of you that spend a lot of time on the workout floor, are there visual cues that you look at to suggest that somebody may not be activating muscles in the proper sequence for a core stabilization exercise?
I've got some in mind.
I think sometimes, it takes like a certain type of like focus when you're doing it to be doing it correctly and firing the muscles. So sometimes you just generally just see people you know, relatively easy exercise to do. And sometimes that's why you get questions of like, why am I doing this? Because it is like, you know, compared to other things they're about to be doing, it is a lot of times like super easy, but a lot of times because of that, you'll see them just kind of like going through the motions. And if they're just kind of going through the motions and just kind of, you know, just getting the set over with, you know, their mind can't be where it's like supposed to be at, and what we're trying to get to and get them to, you know, like mind to muscle and activate in the right spot. So a lot of times it's getting someone to like slow down and concentrate on what we're trying to do versus just like banging the reps out. So
yeah, the two that come to mind that I've used most recently is like even going in with hip hikes. Those are really help with showing and try to going in deep, even with just the hip stabilizers. And I've got a lot of clients that have questions with the weight, like the weight plate upper body twist crunch. That one can just get really funky, particularly if their hips are moving at the same time. So I had a teaching moment with someone yesterday where I kind of held her hips in place and really had her just move in her obliques in a certain way. But those are the obliques being a little bit deeper, but the hip hikes for sure are good from a visual perspective, and really sort of break it down and to sort of feel that hip moving. And I feel a lot of clients are really surprised by how difficult that one is. And that one's a good one.
One that comes to mind for me is the pelvic lift with the band W's at the top. You know, to make sure when they're doing the pelvic lift portion that they're really, you know, trying to push through the heels of their feet, trying to squeeze their glutes, and then like really having like that band W be, you know, for the muscles in the back that we're trying to activate and get them to use. And a lot of times, you know, like you'll see them do the pelvic lift. They're not even like getting all the way up. So you need to know if they're necessarily like squeezing at the top, and then you'll see where the band's at, and it's like around their wrists instead of being like closer to their elbows, and they're just kind of just.
That one's got a lot going on.
So that's the one that comes to mind with me, that there's a lot of correctioning of just like you see them doing some reps and you're like, they're not accomplishing anything with that.
I think a lot of something like that exercise too, I would definitely, you know, I mean, both a pelvic lift and a band W are both exercises that people tend to compensate by going into a ton of extension, right? Like they'll do that with their W and their pelvic lift. So their ability just to keep that, you know, braced core, squeezing the glutes at first, and then also getting that band W will really challenge their stability to not go into that massive extension rib flare movement pattern for both of those. So that's something that I would look for, that extension. Also just like in the crunching, you know, these are things that going back to, you know, one of our first days probably with movement training with Mike or whoever you did it with, is just watching if the legs are moving during their crunches, hip flexors maybe contributing excessively to the movement. And then also whether, you know, like a cable crunch, you know, if they're actually, you know, getting spinal flexion as opposed to just hip flexion. Again, you know, a lot of times, you know, people are not taking that sternum to belly button. They're just sort of, you know, bending over at the hips.
Making a shape.
Sort of thing. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, making a V instead
like
of, you know, a C. They're going like, you know, like, yeah, like this instead of curling it. You know.
Sorry, I'm glad you mentioned.
It's really.
Oh, go ahead, Claire.
Go ahead. I was just going to keep going that route, but.
Well, I was going to say that I think that it's good that you mentioned the hyperlordosis and the excessive extension, because I think that's a significant compensation. I think a significant, almost an exaggerated extreme anterior pelvic tilt is another example of a compensation. Rib flare is a big one that you can see where people can't keep their ribs down. And remember, when we're keeping our ribs down, that's the sign that we're activating our transverse abdominis and our internal obliques. I also think one that we will miss sometimes is breath holding. People could do a lot to stabilize their core by holding their breath, by doing the Valsalva maneuver and just increasing intrathoracic pressure, being very aware of that. And I also think upper trap and SCM activation is another sign that people are bracing. I know I experience this a lot when I do Pilates, where I'll hold my breath and or will use my upper traps to stabilize things. And I can easily do a movement, but it's just the muscles that I'm actually using to do it aren't the appropriate ones.
Yeah. I described activating the transverse abdominis for the other day really well on, it's like the anti-extension for core on. So when you're doing like a plank or the dead bug, of when you extend your arms and your legs, your spine is actively, it will want to extend, but it's really holding everything in. But that's good. I liked that you mentioned the rib flare, because that can be done a lot during pelvic lifts too. A ton.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, the rib flare plus anterior tilt plus, you know, just overall lordosis usually sort of go hand in hand. I feel like they're usually kind of happening all together. Good. I mean, I think anything else on prehab before we move into stability, strength, power? All right. I mean, I liked the section on stability because I think they sort of talked about how it doesn't have to be as complicated as a lot of people make it sometimes. What were your guys' biggest takeaways from the core stability section? Or what do people tend to think about with core stability, and then what can it actually be?
Whenever I think of core stability, I instantly think of Bosu balls.
Yeah.
Of just finding a balance in there. That's immediately. Anytime where you're holding a position, that's what I immediately think of with core stability. Yeah.
Yeah, the article mentions the use of things like Bosu balls and wobble boards and sort of unstable surface training and all that stuff, which this is not. I don't want to go too far into unstable surface training. But you know, then they mention, I guess, what do they mention as some other ways to train stability?
Yeah, so they mentioned that you don't always need equipment. Like they bring up the fact of things that we do, like the single leg RDLs and like the step ups with like the hip flexion and things like that. You know, a lot of people for core stability might think it takes some type of equipment like a Bosu ball or something, and that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, essentially, most unilateral exercises are essentially core stability exercises. We don't always think of it that way, but you know, if you cue it the right way and are, you know, watching for signs of, you know, if you coach a lunge or a step up from a perspective of a core stability, it can really challenge it.
I think it's just obviously a very important just aspect, because obviously this article, like you said, is more like sport, is more like along like the sport realm. And obviously there's a lot of sports out there where it takes a high degree of being able to balance. So definitely an important, as far as an athlete, I think a really important part of you know, how their training should be formulated. I mean, that should be if they're playing that kind of sport, especially.
And then obviously there's our more traditional, you know, isometric stability, like your planks, that sort of thing, which are also another form of, you know, what we've talked about so far, sort of more dynamic stability. And there's your isometric stability. They even also mention, you know, an isometric with dynamic limb movement. So that would be like your marching plank, that sort of thing. So
I think one thing that people often will invert is the order of progression when it comes to core stability. I feel like quite often people are wanting to jump to wobble boards and Bosus and a lot of those proprioceptively richer environments. And in actuality, they just need to be starting with, can you do a plank properly? Can you maintain your balance on one leg on a stable surface properly before you even go to an unstable surface? I think a great core stability exercise is just simply standing on one leg, particularly as people get older. That could be a very, very challenging thing to do. And you can get a lot of core activation by doing something like that. And I just think people are always looking for the flashy, sexy exercise, when in reality, some planks, side planks, Superman holds, a lot of those exercises are some of the best things you can do for core stability. Because there again, it goes back to what we talked about activation wise. If you're not learning how to activate muscles in the proper patterns, you can keep yourself quote unquote stable on top of a Bosu, but not be using the right musculature at all to do so. That's always my biggest knock with unstable surface training. Are you just constantly co-contracting muscles around the ankle, the knee, and the hip to stabilize you, and you're actually not doing anything about the core?
Mhm.
I think a lot of people forget too that the core is literally trained with every single exercise. So like you think of an athlete, a one arm push press, the amount of anti-lateral flexion on that opposing side that's holding you stable when you move explosively with an arm on one side, or even a walking lunge with dumbbells, you rock side to side, and the stability that provides. Like I don't even train a lot of isolated core movements with athletes unless they have some major strength deficit, just because it's so common in every other form of training. I mean, barbell deadlift, barbell squat, there's so many, single arm push press, like so many exercises already have an extreme amount of core involved in them that provide insane core stability if the athlete performs them properly, which usually comes down to the coach providing proper cues and making sure the athlete feels it properly and the muscles are stressed properly. So I think that a lot of this, I think core stability is one of the more frustrating things, because it's one of the things that every adult or every parent wants us to like really focus on, and the kids want to do because they think that they need to do 45 minutes of planking and band exercises and all that type of stuff. But in actuality, the core is trained immensely with their traditional programming.
Yeah, I think a lot of what when people think of the core stability is really, you know, what they would be getting out of that prehab program. And then anything that's more, you know, then I guess this sort of starts leading us more in, I think, even a little bit into strength and power, you know, because, you know, a lot of the movements that we use to train power and strength in the body are also basically, you know, they are not just, you know, push presses is also a core stability exercise, like you just said, or, you know, going into the strength section, a deadlift actually is going to, you know, require quite a bit of, you know, extension. A lot of the extension muscles are, you know, your glutes, your spinal erectors, your abs as well are all going to be stressed really, really intensely on an exercise like that. So, you know, the utility of doing, you know, heavy crunches for somebody that's already, you know, doing deadlifts and squats and stuff like that as an athlete, you know, you could argue that that's, you know, maybe not as necessary.
What if you have an athlete who is doing like a hex bar deadlift and their legs have the strength, but their core doesn't have, like, that you can really see that they're sufficiently arching when they're picking up like a heavier load. So one of my questions with core in this argument or this discussion is, you know, you are using the core a lot, but when does it become that aspect of, okay, where the weakness in the core is going to be limiting their lifting strength, because you can see that their legs do have it, but just their spine can stay in a neutral position. So that's a really good question that I have on, you know, how do you specifically train that core and help you get into those stronger leg movements on, like, how, like in this, because Jared, you were saying that, yeah, you do use the core in that aspect, but if the core is the weakest link, how do you just train the core?
I guess for me, my question would be, if somebody can't maintain a neutral spine on a 185-pound hex bar deadlift, what core exercise are you going to give them that recruits that musculature to the magnitude that you need to improve that hex bar deadlift? Like, are you going to have them do insanely heavy back extensions? Like, that's the thing. If you do back extensions with body weight or a 10-pound dumbbell, that's just a fatiguing exercise for that musculature. What my recommendation would be is take their hex bar deadlift weight down to a weight where they can maintain proper form and build up from there. And if you want to train their legs a little bit heavier, maybe go to a unilateral exercise or put them on a sled where the core is not a limiting factor. But I think that a lot of people confuse core training as core training is, from an activation perspective, they can usually activate those muscles. There's just a strength deficit. So how do you improve the strength to maintain proper positioning on one of those really heavy core lifts? My inclination, and a lot of the research and strength coaches that I've read, is take that exercise down to the appropriate weight where they can maintain that proper technique and then build up from that point. Because there's really
probably no core exercise, no isolation core exercise that you're going to be able to do with a high enough load that's going to reach that threshold of activation anyways. So that's what I usually do with my athletes. And I see this a lot during testing with young athletes. They'll get to a point where like their lower back just can't maintain the proper position. And then you just got to lighten the load and test them at that lighter load. So yeah, I guess, does that answer the question or?
It does. Thank you.
I think another thing related to that, which is also, I've noticed, I mean, I don't work with athletes as much as I used to, but I mean, I think sometimes it's a strength issue and sometimes it's just like a proprioception, like their bodies are changing and growing so much. They're not used to, moving their constantly changing limb segments and lengths through space in the right way. So like, is it actually a core strength issue, or is it just that they need to work on their technique or their proprioception, their ability to produce that movement in with a neutral spine, which to Jared's point would be achieved more just through lightening the load until they can achieve it. And then maybe they might be able to then quickly increase in weight because it was never really a core strength issue. It was just a proprioception and body awareness issue.
Yeah, a good example of that is on a deadlift. So I used this the other day with an athlete that I was working with. They were doing a hex bar deadlift and their back was rounded the whole time. Like I just couldn't, they're like, I just can't get my back into that position. So I said, all right, lay on your stomach and do a Superman for me. So they did it. And I'm like, that's the position that your back needs to be in. And they're like, okay. So they get in the bar in the hex bar again, and they round their back into that position immediately, and they're fine doing it. So he, like Sawyer just said, it wasn't the fact that his core wasn't strong enough to maintain a little bit of hyperextension in the spine or like that natural lordotic curve. It's just that it didn't make sense in his head. So I think that point that Sawyer just made is great. Like if you can get an athlete to actually feel what it's supposed to feel like in a different circumstance, they can transfer it over into that other circumstance. So it's not necessarily his weak core didn't allow him to maintain that. It's just that he didn't know what the fuck he was supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
I like that example, Garrett. Good job. I'll use that.
Yeah, it's a helpful one for RDLs as well. I've used it for RDLs with people that like just consistently have too much flexion in their spine on an RDL. Put them in a Superman position, have them hold it and say, all right, that's what I want your back to feel like. And a lot of times they overcorrect and you're like, all right, you don't need that much hyperextension in your spine. You can take it down a little bit. But it usually allows them to get it in their head what they actually need to be feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you think about it, it's sort of, our bodies, we stopped growing a long time ago, but when you're trying, you see these kids growing like at these crazy rates, like it's no wonder they have trouble coordinating like smooth movement. Yeah. It's just you're trying to produce movement in a constantly changing environment. So.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
What was that?
I was going to say, there's some of these kids with such terrible forward head syndrome and rounded shoulders that I don't know if they'll ever get to that like super extended.
Yeah.
Eric all day.
Eric Bame's two boys, Matt and Andrew Bame, are like the worst posture I've ever seen in a human being.
They're so bad.
You guys remember that doctor that Mike's buddies with at St. Joe's? He's the orthopedic guy, Mike. He came in and gave us a staff D like 5 years ago.
I remember that one.
Not Harwood.
Sure.
What's his name?
Aldrink?
Aldrink, yeah.
Yeah, he was telling us, he's like, we're seeing more and more kids come in with neck issues because they're playing so many games and looking down at their phones. It's crazy. Like it's literally changing the anatomy of these fuckers.
But that's where I do think there is a place for corrective exercises and things of that nature to actually do some foundational strengthening, because in a lot of cases, the loads would have to be so light on the bar to have the athlete even achieve remotely the position we're looking for, because they can't even maintain that position unloaded.
Yeah. I think that it sort of ties into like the progression of what we, how we think of core training, right? Like first, at the very beginning, you have to make sure that we're, we can at least activate the muscles we need to activate, and we are capable of achieving the correct posture. Then from that, then we can start, working from a more, then once we do that, then we can do these more traditional exercises that aren't necessarily, we don't necessarily think of core exercises, but things that stress the core, like our deadlifts and our squats and our RDLs and our lunges, to be able to at least, first, in order to do those properly, have that baseline ability to activate posture. And then from there, then we get into things like power, which you haven't talked about yet, which I think a lot of the parents of the athletes we work with come in expecting their kids to do, all these, plyometrics or medicine ball throws that, you see, like, baseball, like Eric Cressy is always on, on Twitter, showing all these really cool medicine ball movements, rotational movements. But I think, it's sort of, you have to build all this on top of the core is responsible for transferring energy efficiently. That's why the largest reason we need a strong core. But if you don't have those underlying abilities, you're not gonna get anything out of that medicine ball throw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Majority of the athletes that come through our doors aren't at a level to do that stuff. So
they can't even keep their ears where they need to be.
Yeah, so we don't have a whole lot of that go on. I mean, Jason Heisler is one right now. He's an impressive athlete, and he's like the one athlete that I can probably do more with in the workouts than the other ones that we get in. But
yeah, I remember that guy.
But yeah, for that reason, it just wouldn't. Like Kemper was like saying some things to me. He's like, "Can we get like some more like, like some explosive and some more of this like speed, quickness, and agility stuff, and just like their kid, the majority of kids, I don't think that they would benefit from it because they're like so uncoordinated and have such like a weak foundation of strength at the moment that I just don't think would be very beneficial."
I think there could be a good conversation too when we talk about, the level of attention to detail that's needed to progress an athlete up to that level is almost something that's hard to achieve in the confines of our traditional strength solution settings. You have eight people in there, and so that could be something that you could lead to a conversation about either smaller group training or personal training or something, if that's really something that's important to the athlete. In order to progress, I need to be able to have my eyes on your kid the entire session, because otherwise he's just going to continue to ingrain the improper movement pattern, the second I walk away.
Yeah, the other challenging part is with speed, quickness, and agility training, especially like what Ty said, the exercises that we actually need to be implementing in those settings for these kids to benefit are so foundational that they leave those settings and they're like, that was boring as fuck. I didn't do anything cool. I didn't do anything I see Tyreek Hill doing on YouTube with the ladders. It's like the expectations of the parents and the kids are for their 10 to 14-year-old noodle to be training like the most jacked dude in the NFL, and it's just not beneficial for them. So the SQ&A setting that would actually be appropriate are like wall runs where they use one leg at a time, practice their actual movement on those wall runs, and then kids go home and they're like, that sucked. It wasn't fun. I like going to this place better because I got to flip tires and do all this stuff. So that's where it gets really hard too, is just the expectations of parents nowadays are so out of whack that it makes it really tough to run an actual productive program.
Yeah.
It's crazy to me, some of the kids that when you get some kids that come in because they're an athlete and they play sports, and their kids say, oh, they play this sport and this sport and this sport, but it looks like they haven't played some of them, it looks like they haven't played like too much sports their entire lives. It's like, man, it should be, if they've been playing this sport and this sport, basically growing up their entire lives, their movements, their body awareness should be better than this.
Remember, no one actually teaches us how to run properly. I think that's fundamentally one of our athlete development issues in this country, is that everyone teaches you how to shoot a basketball the right way, throw a baseball, kick a soccer ball. There's a technique that's taught. That technique is never taught for just proper linear gait mechanics. And I think that's where a lot of the breakdown starts to occur, is that we are so excited to get to the specific sport skills that we don't take the time to develop a base of proper technique. And then, Tyler, to your point earlier, a base of good strength. If athletes have a base of good strength and good proper linear gait mechanics, then you could build a lot on top of that. Until they have that, Jared, you mentioned that it's hard to do a productive workout if they don't have that. I would actually go a step further to say, if you try to do some of the more advanced work with an athlete that doesn't have that foundation, you're going to train them right into an injury, either during training or during competition.
Yeah. That's a challenging part about youth athletics in general, especially in the United States, is just, it even goes worse. It's not even that they don't learn how to run properly or do these things properly. They don't even learn how to do their sport movements properly in a lot of cases. Like, it's just, let's compete. Let's go play 6 baseball tournaments. I don't care how you fucking throw, as long as you're throwing it past the batter and you're getting strikes. Like, that's all they really care about. And then kids are just a mess down the road. So it's not even that they don't get the basic movement skill for just life and being a human. They also just, there's such a little focus on the technical aspects of sport. It's all so competitive now and just play.
Yeah, I think almost every sport is other than maybe like football is like has year-round teams now. I feel like, you know, everything's year-round. No one's playing multiple sports. And
could you imagine if football was year-round? The concussion would be insane.
Even though contact football isn't year-round, there's 7-on-7 and all of that stuff. I mean, they keep it about as year-round as they possibly can make it.
Yeah.
And I hear like a kid like played like 3 sports, and then they get into like, they're like in middle school and they're like, oh, you know, talking to my parents or whatever, or like, I'm just like right now, I'm not playing those sports anymore. I'm only focusing on volleyball, or I'm only focusing on like when they're like super young. I hate hearing that. I hate hearing that because you can get so much just athletically, just continuing to play multiple sports. You know, down the line, you'll have time to focus in on that one sport. But when you're still growing, like, play them all, because you'll benefit on the volleyball court because you kept playing basketball. But
yeah, there's a lot about it. You know, I mean, we could have an entire training on, you know, specialization, early specialization. But yeah, I mean, completely agree. Mm-hmm. I didn't even start playing football until high school. That was my main sport. I played all the other sports until then, and did just fine once I started playing football. Didn't hurt me. My jeans hurt me more than that. Too short and slow.
I thought you had skinny jeans on.
All right. I guess moving on. Let's see. We can jump ahead a little bit. I think let's talk a little bit. What's up?
I said, I'm curious with your take on dynamic core exercise. Over
That's
here, we thought it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to jump into. Yeah, that's a common one. What were your guys' main takeaways, both from the article and from your own experiences with dynamic core, the safety of dynamic core exercises? So, I guess, the crunches, back extensions, that sort of thing.
I think
from my own experience. Go, Jared.
No, you can go. Go ahead.
I was going to say, from my own experience, it's just solidifying that they have a full understanding of what they're doing. So breaking down and really just making sure that they know how to build and activate properly, which I feel like has been the center of our conversation. And then once you've got that, then is it safe to then too, Mike, to use your breath to exhale, like to really use in your breath with those movements versus holding your breath? Because you did mention breath earlier, but on our end we said it was safe, but you just have to. I
think in general, holding your breath, with the exception of if you're doing spinal loaded movements and you need to use the Valsalva maneuver for additional core stability, I think holding your breath in general is a good way to suggest you're not activating your core musculature properly, because that means you're essentially offloading your core stability on just increased intrathoracic pressure.
So with dynamic core, you can use your exhalations to really can be as dynamic as possible. Like with medicine ball overhead crunch throws.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
And you should. If you're holding your breath, then again, you're relying on basically the mechanics of air to stabilize your core versus your actual musculature.
Good points there. I mean, I know regarding the, if you do it in a stepwise fashion, it's generally safe. Jared, what were you going to say?
No, I just thought that what they put on the sheet was exactly the thoughts that I had. As long as they're progressed appropriately, they don't use excessive ranges of motion, and the volume is in check, I think that they're plenty safe. I mean, obviously, technical ability and the skill to perform the movement is appropriate, as you were mentioning earlier, with like med ball throws or something like that, to actually make sure which goes in a little bit into the vector training. Like if you're going to do a med ball twisting throw for a baseball player or something like that, making sure they can actually hold the ball properly and twist properly, it's going to transfer over into the sport and be safe is important. So I thought that what they put there for the 3 key points was exactly what I was feeling as far as the safety of dynamic core exercises. Just like any exercise, like progress appropriately, make sure the range of motion is appropriate and safe, and then make sure volume is appropriately progressed as well. So
that end range of motion one, I think, super important too. And it's something like back to my point that I was talking earlier about, with the cable crunches, for example, just because that's something that we use a lot with our general population clients, that, they're putting their head down like to their shins and folding like way over versus literally just a tiny little crunch motion there. And that, it's a massive difference on, what you're doing to the lumbar spine.
Yeah, particularly as people get older, women get older who have osteoporosis in their spine, that terminal flexion and range of motion on crunches, particularly when it's repetitive, can definitely cause some issues in terms of potential osteoporotic stress fractures if you go terminal range of motion too much. But I was going to say one thing, this is just my general observation of our core prescription over time. I do think there is an over reliance on spinal flexion based movements, and I think we underemphasize not so much extension, because I think we do a pretty good job of balancing dynamic flexion with dynamic extension. I don't think there's as much of an emphasis on anti-rotation, anti-lateral flexion. I think that those are critically important aspects of core stability to develop that I don't see in our program enough. Essentially, my conceptual framework for core training is there needs to be some kind of anti-rotation, anti-lateral flexion. There needs to be some kind of extension dynamically, flexion dynamically, and then some kind of just straight stabilization exercise, such as a plank or a side plank. I think that in my mind is always a good framework to balance your actual core work, is having all of those things in there rather than 2 or 3 crunch exercises and then 1 extension based exercise.
Yeah, I think that's something that we've transitioned to a lot more, at least when I was writing the more recent RX, definitely tried to include a lot more of, those, we're doing more pal-off presses, the chops, from multiple, lines of pull. Those are pretty challenging, but I agree. Sorry, Jared, what were you going to say?
No, I just think it's important to look beyond the last 4 exercises on the program. So like, for example, if you do a push press with a client with a 1-arm dumbbell, or a step up with a 1-arm press, like there's your anti-lateral flexion right there. So some exercises for the core are easier to, like a anti-flexion exercise, so a plank or something like that, it's kind of hard to do in a traditional exercise. I mean, like a squat is obviously working the back a little bit more than the anti-flexion movement. So I think that if you look at the exercise that you've done for someone that just has general fitness goals, kind of see where you've hit certain things with the exercises, and then you can program the things that were left out or missed with the core specific exercises, since there's not a ton of time or room for those on the program.
And I think we could get more creative to that end with our Gen Pop prescription for activating the core. I think I completely agree with you. A lot of stuff we do with our athletes, Jared, does lend itself to, say, anti-lateral flexion. But with our Gen Pop, we don't have them doing 1-arm push presses, but You could have them do a suitcase squat as an
Yeah.
example, and when you're just holding one dumbbell or something along those lines, or a suitcase lunge or something like that. I think there can be a little bit more creativity put into how, to your point, we incorporate core stabilization into all aspects of the workout, just not the last 3 or 4 exercises.
Definitely. All right, we got about 5 minutes, 6 minutes left. What have we not talked about yet that anybody thinks is important to touch on in these last few minutes we have here?
Well, we didn't talk too much about the Rotary exercises, which, if you're talking like a little bit of like sports specificity and stuff for the, anyone that's throwing or swinging anything, so baseball, hockey, golf, even like a football throw, I mean, that takes a lot of rotation. So when we're training for sports specificity, I think they are good exercises to do. But that was pretty much it, which Jared said, a lot of like a lot of the regular moves that we do are sufficient in training an athlete's core without necessarily giving them like specifically, like this is like an ab movement, like talking about like deadlifts and things like that. But when we're talking sports specificity, and we're talking sports that do like a lot of rotation and working on like an explosive rotating movement like a baseball swing, for the kids that play those sports, I do think it's an important thing to throw in. I mean, when I was at Eastern, we had like explosive Russian twists pretty commonly in our workout programs, and throwing the med balls against the wall type thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that goes back to some of the points we talked about earlier, though, just about progressing to that, because if you're doing an explosive Russian twist with a gross extension pattern, you're probably not only not safe, but you're not really getting what you want out of it. So I think starting with the basics and then starting slow, with something like just like a band Russian twist, which we have in there, going, nice and slow, not really even power, just getting it down first. And then once that's down, obviously doing things like lunges and push presses that also are, 2 of the points we made earlier, essentially going to work on, the lateral, like anti-flexion and anti-rotation, all that stuff. And then from there, once that's down, feel comfortable with that, then we can start adding some of those medicine ball throws or cable Russian, twists or low to high chops, those sorts of things. For sure.
I think the challenge with the rotary movements and the reason that progression is so important is that the vertebral segments themselves actually have a very small rotational range of motion, after which you exceed it can cause injury. The pelvis, when rotating in concert with the lumbar spine, that can open you up to a much greater range of motion, and making sure the athlete has enough proprioceptive awareness to understand the difference between lumbar vertebral rotation versus pelvic girdle, more gross and global rotation, I think is really important to ensuring the athlete stays safe. Because if you rotate a vertebral segment by 30 degrees or more, you're probably going to cause some pretty significant injury. If you are rotating the hips at the same time as you're rotating the vertebra and the lumbar spine, then you won't open yourself up to that same risk. And I just think it's making sure the athlete knows the difference technically and is the proprioceptive awareness to be able to execute that.
And much more technically complex to, properly perform those rotary obviously just spinal flexion, pretty simple, lateral flexion, pretty simple. When you're talking about, rotation, it's involving, the hips and even, your foot position and, your torso moving in concert with your hips. There's a lot more going on. But
I think common theme throughout this entire conversation is, a lot of this stuff is good and you can work on a lot of it, but that the person that's training needs to be on a certain level to be able to do it correctly and actually get something out of it. So
yeah, I think a lot of those med ball throws and those twists and stuff too are things that, to your point, I mean, we talk about this a lot with regards to like not powerlifting, Olympic lifts. Like if you're not doing you're not doing this on your own regularly, it can be hard to coach it properly. So it's one of those things where if you're not super familiar with, perform on some of, a explosive, low to high chop or something like that, or med ball throws, it can be hard to really, to coach it the right way. I don't do those that often. I probably could use some touch up before I went in there and tried to teach somebody how to do it.
Yeah, I did a lateral skip into a med ball twisting throw the other day, and I was like, fuck, I got to do these more often. And then I did it with my left hand, and I was like, fuck, I shouldn't do these at all. I think the last thing I would add is just avoid getting, I think there's a propensity for strength coaches and coaches to get hyper sport specific with core exercises and exercises in general. I think there's obviously a need for some level of specificity on the movements and mimicking stuff in the sport, but I think sometimes we can go overboard and only focus on those movements. I think it's important to step outside of that box a little bit, because the adaptation in the gym is going to show up on the court as long as or the field, as long as they're still playing their sport. So I think that for like a baseball player, obviously med ball skip into a throw explosively is good, or a traditional Russian twist is good, but that doesn't mean you should never train like a low to high chop or something of that nature. So I think that not getting too hyper specific with any type of training, but specifically core training, still is important to remember.
Awesome. Well, it's 11 o'clock. So that's our time, but good conversation. I like this one. It's good. We don't talk about athletes as that much, but it's enjoyable.
Good talk, guys.
Yes.
Thank
See you
you.
guys.
Talk.
Yeah.